Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us here at HBU. And let me just extend a thanks to Dr. Severance and all our speakers just for putting on an excellent conference. In particular, Dr. Severance's service in the Dunham Bible Museum are just treasures to HBU, and we're thankful to have her here, to have the Bible Museum here. It's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Leen Ritmeyer, presenting his paper, Does the Byzantine Church and Maqatir Reflect the Sacred Architecture of the Temple in Jerusalem? Dr. Ritmeyer is founder of the Ritmeyer Archaeological Design, which offers consultancy on archaeological background and illustration to groups as diverse as Hollywood movie companies, National Geographic, the ESV Study Bible, and the new GLO Bible Study Computer Program. Dr. Ritmeyer is an architect for the Khirbet El Maqatir excavation and the premier archaeological architect for Jerusalem and numerous other archaeological sites. So let's welcome Dr. Ritmeyer.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much. I'd like to add my thanks to Dr. Stripling and Diane Severance for organizing this conference. And I can tell you that Diane is also an excellent cook and a very good hostess. Enjoyed the Texan meals she prepared for us yesterday. It was in 1996 that, I believe it was, that Dr. Wood asked me to come to Maqatir and to help out with the drawing up of the architecture of the ancient site. And I made a plan of the gateway, and I made a reconstruction drawing of the gate, which is hanging up in the exhibition there. Then he asked me to design a t-shirt. So I made a t-shirt in the semicircular Associates for Biblical Research, and then my gate drawing, and underneath it said, I, duck, I. Dr. Merrick got a lot of fun out of I, but I wonder if he knows the English take on I, because when I was wearing the t-shirt in England, so in England we've got a road system, motorways, where all the motorways from east to west start with the letter M. So I drove from Cardiff to London on the M4. There's another motorway going north, the M5. There's also there are A5. There's an A1 road from London going up north to York. So somebody asked me, you dug the A1? I started making reconstruction drawings just for teaching purposes. I started in 1973 with Professor Benjamin Mazar in the Temple Mount excavations, and he often asked me to take visitors around to explain the site. So he started the southwestern corner, and then you can see the broken Robinson's Arch, and used to explain the arch. Once came across 42 feet wide, west from the pier, which you can see down below, and there's a series of cross walls which carry the staircase down to the street, which you can see there. And so you continue to the end of the excavation, and you come back by the same corner. There's always somebody that asks me, why are those stones sticking out from the wall? Robinson's Arch. Well, can't I explain, or can't they visualize? So I blame them and made a reconstruction drawing and colored in the bits which you can see. I never had that question again. It's difficult for people to visualize what an ancient site looked like. It's also difficult for them to understand how stratigraphy works, that the deeper you dig, the earlier the period is. So I tried to explain that where we had a Turkish city wall sitting on top of a Muslim palace, and we had taken the floor away, and underneath a beautifully preserved Byzantine room with an archway and a complete mosaic floor. And somebody asked me, why did the Byzantine people live so deep in the ground? So I just said to keep the wind out. But I did find that making reconstruction drawings is very helpful, not only for myself, but for archaeologists and for the people to understand what that pile of stones actually once looked like. Because although my career has been in ruins for 40 years, I enjoyed every minute of it. And so now the Byzantine Church at Maqatir, we talk about the Byzantine Church and the monastery. What is a monastery? What is a church? See that in Israel there are two types of Byzantine monasteries. One is called the Laura, and the other one is called a koinobium. Those are Greek words. The Laura comes from the Greek word which means a path. There's a community of monks who live in separate cells in the mountainsides around it. Most of the week they spend their time in solitude, and then on Saturday and Sunday they come together in the church for prayer, and they receive provisions for the week that follows. So it has a central core with a church, and then a path connecting all those cells together. Here's an example, hope you can see it, of the great Laura of Marsaba in the Judean desert. It now functions as a cornobium, but on the plan on the side you can see the whole Kidron Valley is dotted with cells around it. And so here on the left you can see a reconstruction drawing of that Laura cell. It's actually carved in a cave in the mountain, and using a series of ladders the monk can go in upstairs, and he's got a little chapel there and a bedroom and a cistern. And on the photograph you can see the monastery on the right, and one of the cells, number 29 in this case, on the side of the Kidron Valley. That is the Laura type, and then you've got the Koinobium type, which comes from living together. It's a monastery in which monks all live together, a communal life all week long. They've got a routine of prayer and work and meals, and they work the land together. And they usually are square buildings surrounded by a wall, and you've got big ones and you get small ones. So near Ma'ale Adumim there's a huge Koinobium, the Martyrius monastery, which you can see here on the reconstruction drawing. It's got a huge church, an even larger refectory, because eating was very important for them, and the different houses where they lived. And on the right, provision for animals. So there were stables there where the animals were kept. And there's also smaller ones. There's a reconstruction drawing of a site east of Hebron. It's a small Koinobium of Kunaitira. And I've drawn many of those things for the late Professor Isar Heersveld, who searched the whole of the Judean desert for ancient churches and monasteries, and I used to reconstruct them for him. Now let's then start looking at the architecture of the monastery of Khirbet El Maqatir. Already in 1869, Wilson, one of those early explorers, and those were people that used to ride on horseback or on donkey back with the Bible in their hand, going to places and trying to understand where they are in the scriptures. And he said we could hardly resist coming at once to the conclusion that the site of Abraham's altar was perfectly well known to the early Christians, as Ai was certainly known to them, perfectly known to them by the name that came down by the 4th century, and that the church was purposely built on the spot in commemoration of events which had taken place there. And Albright and Snyder in 1934 wrote, almost due south of Burj Beitin, almost half a kilometer across the valley, lies Khirbet El Maqatir, with remains of an important Byzantine church, perhaps of the 4th century, and probably marking the stone on which Jacob pillowed his head. And it says there, Maqatir's monastery, is likely to come from the 5th to the 6th centuries, while the church itself, as mentioned above, is technically much better executed and may well be from the 4th century. I believe it may be the church of Jacob mentioned by Jerome. So those people knew their biblical associations, Abram and Jacob, and all in this particular place. And they produced simple plans, as you can see. And they asked themselves the question, is it a monastery or a church? We certainly have a church, but the nearby village is called Dir Dibwan, and Dir in Arabic means a monastery. So in the very name of the village, which is built basically of the stones of the monastery, which is hardly anything left of it, the tradition has been preserved that there must have been a monastery in that particular place. And so in 1999, or maybe 1998, Dr. Wood asked me to investigate this monastery, and I'm standing here on the approach road next to that wind-blown tree, leading up to the monastery, which is on the horizon there, just a heap of stones. And so we set out the first excavation square in 1999 at the northeastern corner of the monastery, and here is the first excavation square, where we found a pavement. The church is on your left, and this is a side building attached to the church building itself. But then it was in 2012 when Dr. Stripling came and He excavated this monastery on a large scale, and I'm helping here and discussing the layout of this church and monastery with him. And here you see the eastern wall of the church, because Byzantine churches always face east. And you can see the big central apse and the east wall on your left-hand side. And then you found a crypt. You can see there's that lower area where it says crypt. There on both sides, the beginning of a vault, and the dotted lines indicate where that crypt was once located, at the eastern end of the church. And here's Dr. Stripling standing on the column. We found a complete column. As he takes on the stance of a conqueror, and I can only think that he said, "How are the mighty fallen?" And then we found some architectural elements which are very important. People they often look at the layout of the walls, but these stones, and there's one fragment of that marble chancel screen in the exhibition here, they tell us a lot about how the church actually was built up. Because on the left, you got the remains of a marble chancel screen, because the church has, like this podium here, an apsis, and the ground level was higher than the nave, and you went up by steps, like the steps going up here. But area was screened off by marble screens, and only the presbytery, the bishop and the elders were allowed beyond that particular screen. And the limestone fragment with the rosette on belongs to another screen, probably higher up in the church. And then they found a Corinthian capital, not a capital on a round column, but on a pilaster that is built against the wall. So we know the height of the column because there was a complete one. We have the capital, and so the layout, as Dr. Stripling continued digging there, became quite clear. So we got in the right foreground the side apsis, then we got the central apsis. We found the other apsis later on, the crypt, and then the nave is on the left-hand side, and you can see the column bases have been preserved. So that made it quite simple to draw a plan. Looking west, we have the end wall, the east wall, in the foreground. And you can see the vaulted crypt, and then the column bases of the nave in a westerly direction. And so here you've got an overall plan. This photograph was taken in the end of 2013, I think it was. And there you can see that early pavement, which we found in 1999, and then the apsis in the east wall, the fallen columns. And so the plan became quite clear. But only one or two stone courses have been left, because the whole village of Silvan looked upon this site as a wonderful supply for building stones, and half the village is built with stones from this monastery. And here in the foreground you can see the column bases, and then the west wall of the church was discovered on the right-hand side. And so we got the end wall, the eastern wall, and the beginning where you enter the church on the west. And so it was not too difficult to make a plan, where you can see the central apsis on the top in black, the side building on the right, and then in black the column bases that have been found. And then we had a pretty clear idea that there was an atrium on the west in front of the church, with other buildings which were excavated subsequently. So here we got the plan then in 2013 of the church. You see there's the central apsis, the two smaller apses on the side, and the two rows of columns separating the nave, the central nave, from the side aisles, and a side building on the right-hand side. And actually a complete sill, an entrance doorway into the right side aisle. And then Dr. Stripling never sits still, so and again another excavation, they excavated further to the west of the church where the entrance to the monastery was. And here you can see the door sill, the main entrance into the monastery itself, which would have led through one or two buildings on the side into the central atrium, and then you come to the church itself. So you can see again, photograph from the inside, the doorway, that was the main entrance to the monastery. So here again is a photograph where you see the main sill. You can just see the road there with a little stubby tree on the very top there where I stood in 1999. The tree is still there. And so the plan was developing quite nicely. And so here, looking sideways, looking south, we have in the foreground that bathtub, which may be a baptistry. That was built against the wall of the original monastery, so it is a later addition to the monastery. And so, putting the things together, then on the top of the plan we've got all the excavated remains of the church, and lower down on the plan we've got the entrance with the side chambers with the baptistry. And then in my work I use a lot of parallel architectural studies. You can't just say, well, this church, I go to reconstruct it the way I like. No, you work with other Byzantine churches, see how they were built. And baptistries are often placed in all sorts of different locations. You see them on the western end, at the eastern end, on the side, especially the one on the top left in Avdat North. That is a very similar location to the one in Khirbet El Maqatir. And that is very nicely executed. It's actually, they build a little apse for the baptistry, which is a bath in the shape of a cross. So one person can get immersed in the middle bit, while the two assistants stand on the other side. And of course, the cross is a very well-known Christian symbol. So you see, baptistry, it's quite interesting that in the early churches, they had a baptistry for adult immersion. In the later churches, they only had a stone font for sprinkling. So you can see that people initially were immersed in water, but later were sprinkled. But that immersion, that was certainly the early practice in the Byzantine churches. So that's what we have then, this plan of the church and the entrance to the monastery. How did it work? So I got my pencil out and try to connect the church with the entrance area of the monastery. And as you can see, I've drawn there an atrium. You've got the entrance down below. It has been excavated with the room with the baptistry on the left, other room on the right. Walls going off to the east, so there was another set of rooms there. But there was most likely an open space, a courtyard with columns all around, roofed from the side, so a nice atrium before you get into the church itself. Now, there's a wonderful example of almost an identical plan, Byzantine church, in Kursi on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. It has a central apsis, colonnades on both sides of the central nave, two side aisles, two side buildings, and the entrance down below is just like the one we got in Maqatir, with an entrance, rooms on the side, and the colonnade all around it. So if you got an example of another monastery at the same time, then it is quite legitimate to use that as a parallel to reconstruct the monastery we have in Maqatir. But then we got an additional information of that crypt. See, say that is the floor of the nave where you're sitting. Then how high was the floor of the apsis? It's always at least one step high, but in this case it's at least 2 meters high because you got to accommodate the crypt down below. The vault was once complete and the floor was on top. It's about 2 meters higher than the preserved remains we have of the eastern wall. So I do a reconstructed section through the church. So on the bottom in the dark gray color, those are the remains we have. You can see the crypt there, which I've reconstructed. It was a semicircle, so you can't go much wrong. And then you can see that from the lower nave, you need quite a number of steps to get up to the chancel area inside the central apse. And you see the pilaster capital, which was found. I put it there in the drawing. And above it was a second story. So from the second story, you can look down into the church. And to prevent you from falling down, there was a stone barrier. And I used that limestone screen with the rosette on to reconstruct that fence on the top. And that is how it works. A cross section, you can see then how it works. We have the two side apses, the central apse, a side building, the south annex, and then you probably won't be able to see it, but Below the central apse, you've got a staircase going up and the crypt down below. Now, that's quite unusual, not that the apse is higher, but so much higher and a huge crypt underneath it, which must be quite significant. So putting all those elements together, we have then a reconstruction drawing of the monastery. You see the central entrance with the baptistry on the left, another building on the right. You go in between two other rooms into the central atrium. There was a sloping roof in between the buildings of the church and the other buildings, going down to the middle. So you've got an open courtyard, and then you go into the church itself, which you can see must have had quite a high staircase with the altar standing right in the central apse. We also know that on the bottom left-hand side, there's a big wall there enclosing an agricultural terrace where they must have grown fruit and vegetables, fruit trees, and things like that. Now, that is not the full extent of the monastery, because all over the top of the mountain we can see remains of agricultural terraces. There's a big granary where they store the grain. The olive press, I don't know whether it's possible that it was also used in the Byzantine period, probably not, but they would have had vineyards and olive yards. And so it was a big agricultural complex, but run as a monastery. And it's very similar to one I've drawn up quite a few years earlier in Khirbet El Maqatir, next to Hebron, where you got, as you can see, a courtyard, the church, a building down below, an open courtyard and other buildings, and an agricultural terrace down below. So this gives you a kind of an idea of what that monastery would have looked like. It's important to talk about the significance and the symbology of Byzantine church architecture. It's just not just a building like a house with a bigger or a smaller room. We're talking here about sacred architecture. When you talk about a temple, you talk about sacred architecture. Same with synagogues and churches. Because they're spaces with different degrees of sanctity inside the same building. And the protocol of who was allowed where was very strictly adhered to. Like if you come into anybody can come into the courtyard, but that roofed over area, which worked like a narthex, before the church was only the novices were allowed to go in there. The laity was allowed to go inside the nave only. And the presbytery, the bishop and his other priest, they were allowed into the most holy areas inside the central apse. So different degrees of holiness. And then I used the work of the dean of the St. George Cathedral in Jerusalem, John Wilkinson, who was very interested in church architecture. And he has shown quite clearly that most of the churches have a plan based on the tabernacle, either the tabernacle or the temple. So with the church of Ein Hanania on the very left is the plan of the tabernacle. You know, the Holy of Holies was 10 by 10 cubits, and the Holy was 10 by 20. Got a ratio of 1 to 2. And where you have a veil in the tabernacle, or in the temple as well, beyond was the Holy of Holies, and only the high priest was allowed to go in once a year. Well, the chancel screen follows exactly on the line where the veil in the tabernacle was. So the people were only allowed in the lower area, and the priests were allowed in the higher area, just as in the temple. You can use either the plan of the tabernacle or of Ezekiel's temple, which had a porch and a holy and a most holy, and it works for most Byzantine churches. The one on the right is the church of the Siloam pool in Jerusalem, exactly the ratio 1 to 2, and the dividing line follows exactly where that marble chancel screen was built. So that is quite interesting. So there are many other churches which have the very same plan. I would say that most Byzantine churches have the division from the tabernacle or the temple between a holy place and a normal place and a holier place. And here we've got a plan of the Temple of Solomon on the left, where you can see the Holy of Holies and the holy place. There was no veil in Solomon's temple. There was a wooden partition made of olive wood and overlaid with gold. Or in the Chronicles temple, it speaks about the veil, which I believe describes the temple rebuilt by King Hezekiah. But on the right, we've got the plan of our church in Maqatir. And in red lines, you can see the exact division, as you have in the tabernacle, between the holy down below in the nave and the most holy on the higher level, including the apsis. So there you've got a parallel between the sacred architecture of the temple in Jerusalem, superimposed on the Byzantine church architecture of many churches. So does the Byzantine church at Maqatir reflect the sacred architecture of the temple in Jerusalem? Well, let's look a bit closer at the similarities. So here we've got this section then. We've got the lower area and the higher area and the crypt down below. Now if you compare that with the section through Solomon's temple, if you go back here, you see you've got the lower area, and you go up steps to the higher area inside the main apse. And in Solomon's temple, you also got the holy area is low. You walk up over the ramp of the rock, which is inside the dome of the rock, and then you're on a high level inside the Holy of Holies. Now there's a porch in front of the temple, and we may have a narthex in front of the Byzantine church. So it reflects the sacred architecture of the temple in Jerusalem quite well. Now the sacred architecture of synagogues and Byzantine churches was developed after the destruction of Jerusalem, as depicted here by David Roberts. It was a sad event, and the temple was never rebuilt, but it didn't stop people from worshipping God. And they still needed a building to worship in, which reflected the sanctity of the temple. Now, both the Byzantine synagogue and the church have got a central nave and 2 rows of columns. And I believe that comes from the temple in Jerusalem. So here on the top left you see a reconstruction drawing, a model actually, of the southern part of the Temple Mount. There's one of the CDs which are for sale in there. And on the southern end of the Temple Mount, you can see on the sectional drawing there, was the Royal Stoa, which is a building with a central nave, an apse at the eastern end, and 2 rows of columns with side aisles. And that's a place where people used to gather together. A very useful plan for large gatherings of people. And here's a reconstruction drawing of the synagogue at Merot. So again, you go through a porch area, through the main doorway, and it's like a basilica-type building. There's 2 rows of column, a central nave in the center, and 2 side aisles on the side. Actually, there's a reference in the Talmud that the early churches and the synagogues were so similar that a Christian passing by a synagogue was so confused that he actually made the sign of the cross, not knowing whether it was a synagogue or a church. So the beginning was quite similar. And in Chorazin, very same thing, got a central doorway, 2 rows of pillars, a basilica-type building, I believe based on the basilica, the Royal Stoa in the Temple of Jerusalem. The church service, even most modern-day church services, are based on the service of the synagogue. So Christian liturgy is based on synagogue service. So in the table you got the Jewish synagogue service compared with the first part of the Christian Sunday assembly. Both start with a monumental entry. In the synagogue you have a procession to place the scriptures in position. The early synagogues did not have an Aron Kodesh, as they call it, a special cupboard to keep the scrolls in. The scrolls were kept at the house of the ruler of the synagogue. And if you have been in Capernaum, you can see this little stone there, which they say is the Ark of the Covenant, with wheels underneath. That is not the Ark which they made in the wilderness of Sinai, as many tour guides explain. Now, the word Ark, Aron in Hebrew, means a chest. And it was put on wheels. It's called the Ark of the Covenant because the covenant are the scrolls, the Torah scrolls, which were transported from the house of the ruler of the synagogue to the synagogue. In the Christian service, you have the bishop bringing in the book of the gospel, also in a kind of a procession. So you see the parallel between the two. The Jewish service starts with the call to prayer. They say the Shema, Shema Israel, hear Israel, Yahweh your God is one God. And also in the Christian liturgy, you've got a greeting and a prayer of preparation. And then you have the reading in the synagogue of the law and of the psalms and the prophets. And similarly in the church you've got the law, the psalm and the prophets, and often another psalm and a reading from the New Testament. And then in both of them you've got a sermon, like you can read in the Gospel. If any man has anything to say, let him say forth. And Christ gave the sermon then, just like they did in the synagogue and in the early Byzantine liturgy. And then the meeting is concluded by a blessing by the Jewish priest, if he was present, or the blessing by the bishop in the Byzantine Church. So you can see the very strong parallels between the way a synagogue service is held with the early Byzantine and continued Christian service on a Sunday in the churches. Here's another reconstruction drawing of a church in the Negev Rehovot in the Negev. And there, I don't know where you can see it, you can see the apse there, and then you see the chancel, the presbytery area, and then there's the marble screen around it. But in that particular place, they found the ambo. An ambo is the pulpit or the preaching platform. And that sticks out from the chancel area into the nave. So if this was the church, then there would be a little bridge built from here into a platform, the preaching platform, the ambo, which is in the church. Now that is interesting because here you can see another example in Jerash, where you can see the apsis with the two rows of seats, the altar, and the preaching platform, the ambo, coming out. And that is how they viewed the reading of the scriptures. Because the holy area was looked upon as heaven, where the priests were, and the church down below, where the laity was, that was earth. And so here you've got the word of God coming down from heaven to the earth. Because the bishop will be reading the word of God from inside the chancel area, the holy area. He was still standing in the same level above the nave, talking to the laity. And that's how God's word came down from heaven to earth. And then inside the apsis, usually you used to have 2 rows of seats or 3 rows of seats, and the middle seat was higher than the rest. May have been the case in Maqatir as well, but we got no archaeological remains, so I didn't want to reconstruct it. But on that central higher seat sat the bishop, and the elders were sitting around him. That's exactly what it says in Revelation. Behold, a throne stood in heaven, in the higher area of the church, one seated on the throne, and around the throne were the 24 thrones where the 24 elders sat. You see, the whole language of Revelation is built on Byzantine architecture, or they use that to reflect this theology, whatever you call it, into church architecture. And here's another church, because most churches look the same. The Israeli army, they have a unit for the knowledge of the country, and they take all the soldiers over the whole land of Israel, and they asked me to provide reconstruction drawings for the different sites. So you got the Temple Mount, the Masada, and then they wanted to have one of the Byzantine Church. So which one? I said, just make one generic one. They all look the same. Because the principle is all the same. You see, you've got an atrium in the front, you've got a nave there, step up, 2 steps up to the presbytery, the chancel and the altar, and the ambo, where the word of God came down from the higher area to the lower area. And so we can see then the Byzantine church as the heavenly tabernacle, where you have behold, a throne stood in heaven. There's a throne at the end of the apsis in the center where the bishop sat. Then the 24 elders used to sit around him. Then in Revelation 8 and verse 3, it speaks about a golden altar before the throne. And that's where you often find the remains of a marble altar. Then it speaks about the souls under the altar of those that have been slain for the word of God. And often below the altar, there is a hollow space where a reliquary was put, often having bones of some saint buried there. And then you got the ambo, the preaching platform, the pulpit, sticking out from heaven, from the holy area, and being read out to the people on the earth. That was the bread, the word of God, which came down out of heaven unto the earth. Now, we do have a crypt in Maqatir, but what was it? A reliquary or a crypt? Those are two different things in architecture. So a reliquary is a container for relics. There may be the physical remains of saints, such as bones, pieces of clothing, or some object associated with saints or other religious figures. And the use of reliquaries became an important part of Christian practices from at least the 4th century. Initially in the Eastern Church, which adopted the practice of moving and dividing the bodies of saints much earlier than the West. You may have an arm bone of St. Mark in Israel. His foot is in Turkey somewhere. Never mind. Now we can check who the bones actually belong to. But a crypt comes from Latin crypta, which means a concealed or private area. A stone chamber, often vaulted, below the floor of this holy area, possibly containing sarcophagi, coffins, or relics. They're often found below the main apse of a church, but later were located also beneath the naves and the transept as well. And occasionally churches were raised high to accommodate a crypt at ground level. That's exactly the case in Maqatir. You have to raise the floor level quite high to accommodate the vaulted crypt down below. Here's another example of a Byzantine church near Tiberias on Mount Berenike. And there, Isar Hirschfeld found a very interesting reliquary below the altar. You see there at the end the apsis and the marble altar, and below it is a reliquary. Now, I made a drawing of it, because here's then the stone table, the altar, and there was a stone floor with a hole in it, and underneath was a stone anchor from one of the ships that plied the waters of the Sea of Galilee. And he used to drop little drops of oil on the anchor. And it may indicate the beginning of the anchorite, which is an early Christian group of people that believed whatever. So that is a reliquary. And you've got many different types of reliquaries. Now, Maqatir, we don't know if there was a reliquary, we don't have it. We certainly do have a crypt. What was a crypt used for? In the Crusader period, the Dome of the Rock was used as a church. And in the top right corner, you can see a reconstruction drawing of the high altar that stood on the rock, with a staircase going up. On the left were two little chapels. One was called the Chapel of the Dream of Jacob, which he had in Bethel. Remember the ladder? Well, the Crusaders thought Bethel means the house of God, so it must have been in Jerusalem. So they built a chapel to Jacob's dream in Jerusalem. So Bethel, by the way, Dr. Wood, is in Jerusalem. But the crypt underneath it was used by the Crusaders to worship the memory of Zacharias, to whom the angel Gabriel appeared. So people used to come together for a little ceremony to remember something. There's a church on the Mount of Olives, the Eleona Church, and that also had a crypt underneath the central apsis, as you can see colored in yellow there. And you can go underneath, and there are little ceremonies there commemorating the meeting between Jesus and the disciples, which they believed happened in that particular cave. So the church was built later on top of it. So crypts were used to commemorate a certain event or certain people. Going back to Rehovot in the Negev, there is also a crypt, very elaborately built. Here's a sectional drawing, two staircases from the side aisles going down to a vaulted crypt underneath. And you can see the sectional drawing there. So below the central apse, under the ground, is another crypt, again for pilgrims to commemorate special events. We don't know what they commemorated at that particular time. There's one more interesting church in the Galilee, Khirbet excavated by Mordechai Aviam. That has both a reliquary and a crypt. They found an inscription in the mosaic floor saying that the church was dedicated to St. George, and the construction dates to 518 AD. Underneath the apse, one of the side apses, they found buried underneath the floor level a particular stone that was their reliquary. But on this reconstruction drawing, you can see then where the reliquary was, in the side aisle on the right there. But underneath the church, and accessible only from the side, was a crypt. And here you see both a photograph of the completely preserved crypt, the entrance to the crypt on the left, and the inside vault on the right. And that gives us a very clear picture of what the crypt in Maqatir must have looked like. So here we got a picture then of that entrance to the crypt at Khirbet El Maqatir. You can see on the main entrance leading down into the crypt, on the left-hand side, we've got 2 doorpost stones standing, and only one on the right. And I think that's the total height of the doorway. It was a very low doorway, because if you reconstruct it, then the vault itself would make it impossible to have a higher doorway. It doesn't make any sense, because you'd just bang your head against the vault. So it was a very low entrance to the vault below the chancel area of the Byzantine Church in Khirbet El Maqatir. So I hope that shed then a bit of light on this monastery of Khirbet El Maqatir, and I hope that you agree that there are quite a lot of reflections in the sacred architecture of our church at Maqatir, the monastery, with the temple in Jerusalem. But then the last question is, the final intriguing question, what was in the crypt? What do you suggest? What's that? An empty tomb. Well, it was Jacob, but Jacob was buried in Hebron. Any other ideas? Basically, we don't know. So, I got a few suggestions, and you can pick and choose one of them. Was there the stone from Abram's altar? Was there preserved the pillar which Jacob raised up and anointed? Maybe there was Joshua's spear was in the crypt. Or a reliquary containing Jacob's bone. You can let your imagination run by it. And with that I say thank you very much for listening to me.
All right, do we have any questions?
On the right.
I understand that the pottery shards can only be dated by a sequence or a chronology. How does this chronology initiate or get started? How can you
About
determine
the Byzantine churches, you mean?
I'm sorry?
About the Byzantine churches. How does the chronology start in the Byzantine churches?
I was thinking mainly of the pottery shards.
Yes, well, so I work as an architect, as an ancient architect, because Stripling said I'm an ancient person, and I don't deal with potsherd. What was the date, Dr. Stripling, of the potsherd? Late 4th till the 6th century. That would actually agree with the observation then by, was it Wilson, who said the church is much finer built than the monastery, which may be 4th century. The monastery later built in the 5th century. As I've shown you, that the baptistry was built again against the outer western wall. So there's a development. I think they started with the church, and then they built a monastery around it and added other auxiliary building against it on the right. And we haven't finished excavating yet, because at the eastern wall, there are at least 2 or 3 walls going off in an eastern direction. So there were more buildings built around it. We haven't really found the buildings where the monks actually lived. Maybe the bishop had his palace there, because the walls that come out from the eastern wall are of very high quality. So we haven't finished excavating yet, and I hope that it still will be excavated a bit further.
When was the monastery and church destroyed?
Most of the Byzantine monasteries and churches were destroyed in 614 AD by the Sasanians. They invaded the land and they smashed up all the churches and the monasteries, and they were there for almost 2 decades, and then they were thrown out again by the early Muslims. But that Sasanian invasion caused a lot of destruction to Byzantine sacred buildings. 614 is the destruction of most Byzantine churches and monasteries in the land of Israel.
you mentioned the difference between people being allowed into the holy place and not. As the centuries went on, did you notice any kind of a theology of the priesthood of all believers to where people are being allowed into more holy places?
Well, you got to go to seminary. You start out as a novice outside. Once when you've had your instruction, then you're allowed to be part of the laity. And if you continue to study, you can become eventually an elder and eventually a bishop. So it's just a matter of studying. Quite interesting that in the 2nd century, you could not be appointed a bishop unless you know all of the Psalms by heart. But that was their hymn book. You see, they used the Psalms and they had to know it by heart. So you want to be bishop? Start learning your Psalms.
Yes, ma'am.
I notice that you've been talking about monks and monasteries. At what point in history did they begin cloisters or chapels for women?
The separation between men and women started already in the Second Temple. In Herod's temple, you have the temple building itself, and you get in the holy area where the altar was and the areas where they prepared all the animals for sacrifice. You got a big Nicanor gate, and you got the court of the women. It was called the court of the women because that was as far as women were allowed to go. And when Mary offered those 2 pigeons for sacrifice, she was allowed to walk up the 15 semicircular steps, stand in the side gate of the Nicanor, and watch how the priest offered the sacrifices for the day. Later on, they added galleries around that court of the women, and the women were relegated to the top because the men were distracted by the women. I don't know whose fault it is. I think it's rather the men, but there you go. In the synagogue, you do have a difference. You also got the galleries, where the women were only allowed in on the 2nd story, and they often had an external staircase for them to go up, so they didn't mix at all. But in the beginning, I think the laity was made up of both men and women, all worshipping together. But the services were always led by the men.
Any other questions? All right, well, let's thank
Okay, thank you.